Hey, it's Chuck with the team at HR Stories. That's hrstoriespodcast.com. This week we shared a story, actually several stories about sexual harassment, retaliation, and something called constructive discharge. What's constructive discharge? Well, here are the main points you need to know. First of all, we know what sexual harassment is. We've talked about it on the show before, and many targets of sexual harassment are afraid to come forward because they fear retaliation from their employer or coworkers. Now, retaliation is a common problem also in the workplace, and retaliation can take many forms, including termination, demotion, or negative performance reviews. But building upon that is something called constructive discharge. Now, that's another issue that can come out of cases of harassment and retaliation. It occurs when an employer creates working conditions that are so intolerable that a reasonable person would feel compelled to resign. The employer basically constructs a situation specifically meant to target a particular employee. Now, this can be at times a difficult legal standard to meet, but it's important to understand the concept of constructive discharge in cases where an employee is forced to quit their job due to harassment or retaliation. You see, actually in 2004, the U.S. Supreme Court held that constructive discharge is a thing, and it can be a claim if an employee can prove that the conditions were so intolerable that they were forced to quit. And the intention of making those conditions intolerable was to force the employee to quit. Now, constructive discharge is not only isolated to sexual harassment. For example, any retaliation against an employee can lead to constructive discharge. For example, an employee files a report on illegal behavior that the company is doing, and let's say the company or the employer retaliates against that employee. Perhaps a claim of constructive discharge could be evident. Another time constructive discharge can happen is if there's an unsafe working condition. And let's say an employee is required to work in an environment that is hazardous to their health or safety, and the employer fails to address the issues despite repeated requests that the employee made. Well, and if the employee quits, that can be a claim for constructive discharge. So constructive discharge is an important concept to understand. In the Me Too era, it's taken off a bit because it's led to an increase in constructive discharge claims, particularly in cases involving sexual harassment or assault, where many employees who have been subject to harassment or assault feel they can no longer work for their employer and choose to resign. Folks, this has been an HR Stories short. Listen to the full episode on the HR Stories podcast, where there's a lesson in every story.